Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Mm.
Today, we're going to be exploring the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer,
Oh boy.
one of history's most notorious figures.
Yeah.
But obviously, we're not here to sensationalize or glorify his actions at all. We just want to try to understand,
Right.
how is it that someone could commit such horrific acts? Were they born that way, or
Yeah.
were they created? So to help us kind of unpack this really complex case,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to be analyzing excerpts from this psychobiographical study.
Okay.
And this study uses the theories of Erik Erikson and Alfred Adler to kind of try and, gain some insight into Dahmer's life and actions.
Right.
So,
So yeah, it's a question that has haunted us for centuries, right? Like, are monsters born or are they made? And I don't know if we're going to have a definitive answer, but hopefully exploring this case through the lens of
yeah.
Erickson and Adler will give us some perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And, the study starts off by painting this picture of Dahmer's early life. And he seems like your average kid from a middle-class family,
Right. Right.
But like underneath the surface, were there any early indicators of the darkness to come?
Yeah. Researchers suggest that even these seemingly normal childhoods can harbor these subtle disruptions that can have a lasting impact.
Okay.
And, take Dahmer's mother, for instance, Joyce. She struggled with mental health,
Okay.
and the home environment was really tense.
Right.
And this ultimately culminated in a divorce when Dahmer was a teenager.
Wow. Okay. So that makes me think about Erickson's stages of psychosocial development.
Mm-hmm.
That was right during his identity versus role confusion stage.
Exactly.
So that seems significant.
Yeah, and even before that, right? Like during those crucial early years, there were some potential disruptions. Like Dahmer had to have a double hernia surgery before the age of 4.
Oh, wow.
Now, on its own, maybe not that traumatic, but, for a child that young experiencing surgery, pain separation from his parents.
It can be a lot.
Yeah, and especially during, Erickson's first stage.
Right.
Trust versus mistrust.
Yeah, if that fundamental trust is shaken that early on, I mean, that can have a ripple effect on your development, right?
Absolutely. And then on top of that, the family moved a lot.
Right.
And, for a kid already struggling with social interaction like Dahmer was,
Right.
that kind of constant upheaval can just make it that much more difficult to form those stable attachments.
Right. And it's interesting, the study also mentioned that Dahmer had this early fascination with animal anatomy,
Oh, really?
starting around like age 4.
Okay.
And his father was a chemist, and I guess he was removing animal bones from beneath their house.
Oh, wow.
And Dahmer was like captivated by these sounds. And later he started collecting roadkill,
Yeah.
dissecting animals,
Right.
completely absorbed by their insides.
Huh.
Could this be another piece of the puzzle here?
It's significant, right? It suggests this preoccupation with death
Right.
and a detachment from, I guess you could say, the typical emotional responses to it.
Right.
He was trying to understand life and death, but through this purely mechanical lens, devoid of, the emotional weight that most people associate with death.
Yeah, that's chilling. It seems like these early years might hold more significance than we realize.
Absolutely. To understand like the trajectory of Dahmer's life, you have to understand those formative experiences.
Right.
And these weren't just isolated incidents, These were threads that were woven into the fabric of his development.
Yeah.
And it potentially shaped his worldview and how he interacted with the world.
Okay.
Right.
That's
So,
interesting.
yeah. As we kind of get into Dahmer's adolescence, it seems like those early threads that we talked about start to weave a more disturbing tapestry.
Yeah.
The study suggests that his isolation deepened,
Yep.
and it really pushed him further into himself and his fantasies.
Yeah, it's like those early disruptions to his sense of trust and autonomy combined with, all the social challenges that teenagers face. It just created a perfect storm.
Yeah. And the study highlights this crucial point. Dahmer's fantasies started to revolve around control. And that's a theme that unfortunately would define his life. Initially it manifested just to his imagination.
Right.
But as he got older, they took on a more sinister form.
The analysis also mentions that Dahmer starts experimenting with alcohol in high school.
Mm.
And I wonder if that played a role in blurring the lines between fantasy and reality for him.
Well, alcohol can certainly lower inhibitions.
Yeah.
It makes it easier to act on impulses that you might otherwise suppress.
Right.
And, the study kind of paints this picture of Dahmer using alcohol to numb himself,
Right.
Escape the anxiety and the pressures of the real world.
Escape.
But it was a dangerous coping mechanism.
Yeah, and tragically, this is where we see that darkest turn. At 18, Dahmer commits his first murder.
Right.
The victim, Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker that he picked up and invited back to his place.
Wow.
It's chilling to think that, this seemingly ordinary encounter became the catalyst for such a string of horrific acts.
Yeah, the study really describes this first murder as a turning point.
Yeah.
Dahmer's internal world collides with reality in just the most devastating way.
Right.
Remember those fantasies of control we discussed?
Yeah.
Hicks wanted to leave, and Dahmer just couldn't cope with that rejection.
Oh.
And he bludgeoned him to death with a barbell.
It's hard to grasp the psychological shift that must have happened at that moment.
Yeah, and it's important to note that this wasn't just some spontaneous act of violence.
Mm-hmm.
The study suggests that Dahmer had been harboring these fantasies about, controlling and dominating others for years.
Right.
This murder was the culmination of those dark desires.
Wow.
The point where they crossed over from imagination to reality.
Okay, so then the study fast forwards 9 years to 1987. Dahmer has moved to an apartment in Milwaukee.
Right?
And this period marks a horrifying escalation in both the frequency and brutality of his crimes.
Yeah.
And it seems like this new environment, away from any familial oversight, gave him this dangerous sense of freedom.
That's a crucial observation.
Yep.
Remember how we talked about Dahmer's potential struggles with autonomy and control?
Yeah.
This move to Milwaukee could be seen as this twisted assertion of independence.
Wow.
But obviously with terrifying consequences.
Right.
In this new setting, he's free to act out his fantasies, and we see the emergence of his modus operandi.
Right.
Luring victims, using drugs or alcohol to subdue them, and then enacting these horrific rituals.
The details of his crimes are so disturbing. The study describes acts of necrophilia,
Oh, gosh.
which, for those who aren't familiar with the term, that involves a sexual attraction to corpses.
Right.
There are also accounts of cannibalism and even attempts to create what he called zombies through crude lobotomies.
It's disturbing, right?
Yeah.
This evolution of his so-called signature,
Right.
it speaks to this escalating need for control,
Mm.
a desire to not only dominate his victims in life, but to possess them even in death.
Right.
This zombie creation, as horrifying as it is, reveals this warped understanding of human connection.
Right.
He was so terrified of rejection and abandonment that he sought to literally turn his victims into mindless slaves.
God, it's just awful.
Yeah.
The study goes into some specific cases.
Right.
And while it's hard to hear, I think it's important to understand the nuances of his crimes
Mm-hmm.
if we really want to try and grasp the underlying psychology.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's the case of Anthony Sears, who Dahmer met in 1989.
Okay.
Now, Sears was considered attractive,
Okay.
and Dahmer went to great lengths to preserve his body.
Oh, wow.
He bleached his skeleton and kept his skull as a trophy.
Oh, my gosh.
It's a stark reminder that for Dahmer, these victims weren't human beings.
Right.
They were objects, possessions to be used and discarded at will.
That objectification, that dehumanization,
Yeah.
it's a chilling hallmark of so many serial killers.
Right.
It allows them to distance themselves from the enormity of their actions.
Yeah. Another case the study highlights is that of Conrad Sinthasumphone,
Okay.
a 14-year-old Laotian boy Dahmer met in 1991. And this one's particularly disturbing because Dahmer was actually caught by the police, but managed to talk his way out of it.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, so Sinthasumphone managed to escape from the apartment naked and dazed and was found by 2 women who called the police.
Wow.
But incredibly, Dahmer convinced the officers that Sinthasumphone was his adult lover,
Really?
and they were having a domestic dispute.
Oh, my gosh.
The police believed him and returned Sinthasumphone to Dahmer's apartment.
Oh, it's awful.
It's just a tragic failure of the system.
It is, and it's a reminder of, the societal biases that often protect predators like Dahmer.
Right.
Sadly, after the police left, Dahmer murdered Sinthasumphone and continued his horrific ritual.
God. These cases, while difficult to process, they offer valuable insights into Dahmer's psyche.
Yeah.
It seems his need for control was becoming an all-consuming obsession.
Yeah.
And his ability to compartmentalize,
Right.
to separate these gruesome fantasies from his everyday life was breaking down.
It's a crucial point. Dahmer's losing the ability to maintain his facade.
Yeah.
The cracks are widening, and his dark inner world is starting to seep into his outer life.
Right.
And it all comes crashing down in 1991 with his arrest.
One of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and flag down a police car.
Wow.
He led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment,
Okay.
and there they uncovered a scene of unimaginable horror. Polaroid pictures of dismembered bodies, skulls in the refrigerator, a vat of acid. It was a house of horrors straight out of a nightmare.
Dahmer's arrest marked the beginning of the end, but it also initiated a new chapter, the psychological evaluation of Jeffrey Dahmer.
Wow. So we're back, and I got to say, this deep dive has been a heavy one.
Yeah.
Dahmer's arrest and then, that horrifying apartment being uncovered. It's just hard to wrap your mind around it all.
It really was a moment that shocked the world,
Yeah.
A brutal glimpse into the darkest corners of human behavior.
Yeah, like the apartment, as it's described in this study.
Yeah.
It was like a museum of his crimes, like a macabre museum.
Right.
Polaroids of his victims, posed and dismembered. A collection of skulls, human remains.
Oh my gosh.
In various states of decomposition, it's almost beyond comprehension.
Yeah.
How could someone capable of such atrocities maintain this seemingly normal outward existence for so long?
It's a question that gets at the heart of, what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think this is where Adler's concept of the lifestyle becomes so relevant.
Okay.
Remember, Adler believed that individuals construct this private logic,
Right.
a way of seeing the world that justifies their actions,
Right.
even when those actions are, clearly harmful or destructive.
So you're saying that Dahmer had created this internal world,
Yeah.
this framework that allowed him to compartmentalize these horrific acts,
Exact.
separate them from his everyday life.
Yeah, on some level, he likely understood that what he was doing was wrong.
Right.
But his lifestyle, his privately constructed logic, allowed him to rationalize it.
Wow, that's chilling.
Yeah.
It makes me think about, the psychological evaluations that were conducted during his trial.
Yeah.
So now we're dealing not just with, guilt or innocence, but the question of sanity.
Right.
Was Jeffrey Dahmer mentally ill?
Right.
And if so, to what extent did that impair his ability to control his actions?
Well, the study mentions that several psychiatrists testified during the trial.
Okay.
And as often happens in these complex situations, there was no easy consensus.
Of course.
Some diagnosed Dahmer with borderline personality disorder,
Okay.
pointing to, his intense fear of abandonment,
Right.
his unstable relationships, his impulsive behavior.
Others focused on the necrophilia, that
Mhm.
attraction to corpses.
Yeah.
And then still others believed that he suffered from a psychotic disorder,
Mm-hmm.
citing his distorted perceptions of reality
Mm-hmm.
and his struggles to distinguish right from wrong.
And it's important to remember that these diagnoses aren't mutually exclusive. It's entirely possible that Dahmer was grappling with multiple mental health issues,
Yeah.
each one contributing to his overall psychological state.
So the defense argued that Dahmer was legally insane,
Right.
meaning he couldn't control his impulses because of his mental illness.
Right.
But ultimately, the jury rejected that plea
Yeah.
and found him guilty on all charges.
Wow.
15 consecutive life terms.
It's a verdict that reflects just how complex this case really was.
Yeah.
While there was compelling evidence of mental illness.
Right.
The jury ultimately decided that Dahmer was responsible for his actions.
Right.
And that he had the capacity to understand that what he was doing was wrong.
That's a tough pill to swallow,
Yeah.
Knowing what we do about his childhood,
Right.
his struggles, his disturbing fantasies,
Right.
it's hard not to wonder if things could have gone differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there had been some intervention earlier,
Mm-hmm.
if he had received the help he so clearly needed,
Right.
could those horrific crimes have been prevented?
It's the question that lingers long after, we close the book on this case.
Yeah.
And there's just no easy answers.
Right.
But the study does mention Dahmer's time in prison.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, he seemed to find some peace.
Really?
Yeah, he reportedly underwent a religious conversion,
Huh.
studying the Bible, and claimed to have found God.
It's hard to know what to make of that.
It is.
Was it genuine remorse?
Yeah.
A desperate attempt to find meaning in the face of, such depraved acts?
Right.
Or was it just a way to manipulate his new environment?
It's hard to say.
Yeah, we can only speculate.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that he also expressed a desire to try and understand his own motivations.
Yeah, for the first time, maybe he was confronting the depths of his own darkness.
Yeah, tragically, Dahmer's life ended in 1994
Right.
when he was murdered by a fellow inmate.
Christopher Scarver,
Right.
who claimed that he was just disgusted by Dahmer's crimes.
So Dahmer's death, brought a physical end to his story. But his case continues to fascinate, horrify, and challenge your understanding of, what it means to be human.
It's a reminder of the potential for darkness that resides in us all.
So what can we take away from this deep dive into the life of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yeah.
It's been a journey into the shadowy corners of the human mind,
Yes.
exploring this intricate interplay of nature and nurture, trauma and choice,
Yeah.
and the complexities of mental illness.
I think the key takeaway here is that there are no easy answers when it comes to understanding extreme deviance.
Yeah.
Dahmer's story underscores the importance of mental health awareness and early intervention.
Hmm.
It forces us to ask these tough questions about responsibility and
Right.
the limits of free will when mental illness is involved.
Yeah, and it reminds us that the potential for both darkness and light exists within us all.
That's right.
Oh, it's a powerful and unsettling thought to end on, but an important one nonetheless.
I agree.